I'm Professor Stephen Coleman, and I've spent many years researching and writing about political communication. I'm interested in how politicians speak to us, how we speak to them, and what we do to each other. In today's episode of The Sound of Politics, we begin a short series of episodes looking at the question of political free speech. When does the use of words become unacceptable? How can we preserve an open field for political expression? And my guest today is the Cambridge philosopher Arif Ahmed.
We commissioned polling of academics that we published in the summer, which indicates that about 20%, so 1 in 5 academics, feel afraid to discuss controversial subjects in their teaching. It rises to a higher level to doing controversial research. And also we find it significant that it's significantly more women than men are afraid to discuss controversial subjects, and significantly more non-white academics than white ones.
I have only one thing to say. You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender.
We cannot afford 4 more years of this, Philadelphia. But the good news is, right now you can choose change.
And I want you all to know that we are fighting the fake news. It's fake, phony, fake.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.
The long-cherished ideal of free speech is giving way to practices of anxious speech. A new language of nervous circumspection frames contemporary discourse as people find themselves retreating into a repertoire of equivocal political expression that has come to symbolize something of a contemporary moral panic. The sound of politics is now replete with footnotes of tedious critique, reactive impulses to castigate. Listen to it. It seems to be everywhere.
70% of Brits say political correctness has gone too far. And I think Farage is just saying what a lot of people out there are thinking.
I fear for the day that someone gets into this union and starts to know platform speakers, because there will never be a return from that.
Some people say cancel culture, and what they mean is an asshole countering accountability, finding out that people don't like them. No one is obligated to take in your opinion.
Would you mind defining woke? Because it's come up a couple times and I just want to make sure we're on the same page.
This is going to be one of those moments that goes viral. I mean, woke is something that's very hard to define, and we've spent an entire chapter defining it. It is sort of the understanding that we need to totally reimagine and redo society in order to create hierarchies of oppression.
Hardly anyone disagrees that free speech is a good thing, except for some people who object that other people's speech is a little too free. That what I call having my say, you call trampling over my values. So my questions today are, why is this moral panic around political speech happening now? And how have universities become so perilously caught up in it? My aim is not to tell anyone what to think about contemporary controversies regarding free speech. The questions are complex. The best answers are not glib. But I do want us to reach a point of understanding about how to think, and more importantly, how to speak about free speech in ways that nurture it rather than closing it down. As an ideal that came to be valued during the Enlightenment, the right to free speech is based upon the assumption that all human beings possess a capacity for judgment, which they should not only be free to express, but to contest and refine through a process of unfettered communicative interaction with others. As the great Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant put it, any external power which wrenches away from people's freedom publicly to communicate their thoughts also takes from them the freedom to think. That single gem remaining to us in the midst of all the burdens of civil life, through which alone we can devise means of overcoming all the evils of our condition," unquote. But this classical liberal idea of expressive freedom was based upon two constraints that effectively limited access to the public platform. The first of these constraints was articulated by Walter Bagehot, the most prominent theorist of the English Constitution, when he wrote of the political role of the newly enfranchised public, that, I quote, "Notwithstanding their numbers, they must always be subject, always at least be comparatively uninfluential. Whatever their capacity may be, it must be less than that of the higher classes, whose occupations are more instructive and whose education is more prolonged." So for most of our history, well into the 20th century indeed, this culture of expected mass deference prevailed, meaning that a wide range of groups, in fact constituting a majority of the population, were effectively excluded from being given a proportionate or respectful hearing within the public sphere. Or to put it another way, the presence and voices of most people, women, those whose skin was not white, blue-collar workers, disabled people, children, while never fully silenced, tended to be spoken for, often with a certain condescension, sometimes with ridicule, and at other times so dismissively as to render them politically invisible. In this culture of deference, public school boys and Oxbridge graduates were deemed to speak the Queen's English and given a pass to participate eloquently within the political domain, while others, characterized as the masses, a term that we never use to refer to ourselves, incidentally, were deemed to possess a certain irrelevance before they even opened their mouths. The second constraint on free speech was structural, because for most of our history, a number of extremely powerful institutions have acted as gatekeepers to the public sphere. A handful of leading newspaper editors have framed the national debate. Broadcasting was organised around a project to allow in certain voices and to exclude others. Universities, as knowledge centres, were geared to socialising the children of parents who had themselves gone to universities, with a view to reproducing a certain way of seeing the world. And this culture of deference and institutional gatekeeping worked pretty efficiently to recursively reinforce practices of free speech in which, while anyone could technically say anything, only certain styles of expression were allowed access to technologies of dissemination and cultural valorization. It was a long period of history in which relatively uncontested notions of political propriety, what could and couldn't be said, and how to say it, prevailed. It was, in the current lingo, an era of conservative, with a small c, political correctness. There were things you could say and things you couldn't say, ways you could speak and ways you couldn't speak. And it was not so long ago. I was born into that era. Historians will argue about when the age of deference began to decline. The 1960s and 70s are strong candidates. But whenever and however it occurred, there can be no doubt that contemporary political culture is anything but deferential. What the eminent political scientists Gabriel Armand and Sidney Verber used to refer to as the civic culture, based upon what they called allegiant participant citizens, is no more. We live in an age where the idea of shutting someone up because they've transgressed the boundaries of conformity tends to make us feel uneasy. Likewise, the structural power of traditional gatekeepers has been blown apart by a new media ecology in which it's so much easier for people to make their voices heard. You might not be regarded as the right kind of politician or intellectual or activist to appear on the BBC Today programme, but you can now speak to an audience 10 times bigger than its audience. The idea of the voice that doesn't pass the elite audition is beginning to seem quite obsolete. Now, this change has produced a surge of anxiety on the part of formerly peremptory political and knowledge elites, concerned not only about losing their former cultural authority, but panicked by fear of uncontrollable voices that are coming to the fore. They might not have read the words of Bajot that I quoted earlier, but they would agree with their spirit. We shall explore in a future episode, when I'll be speaking with the documentary maker, Rick Bienstock, how an organised movement of ideological reaction emerged with the purpose of attacking what they saw as a rival lexicon of political correctness to their own, and how that in turn gave rise to a cultural movement that turned from correcting the incorrect to shutting it down. My observation for now is that both of these movements are products of a moral panic. Neither can win, but both regard nothing less than total victory as anything other than abject defeat. Nowhere has the impasse of this moral contestation been more visible than on university campuses. More visible, I say, because suppression of free speech has indeed been much starker in certain other social contexts about which political critics have had far less to say. But it's hardly surprising that universities are at the centre of the free speech storm, for they are spaces in which society nurtures critical minds and encourages the rehearsal of disruptive ideas. Traditionally, universities were something of a monoculture, an extension of the public school process of generating a singular version of intellectual authority, which was itself rooted in the capacity of parents' ability to buy their children social privilege. But over the past 50 years, that higher education monoculture has broken down, with broader sections of the population attending universities, teaching and researching in them, and writing the books that are studied in them. Defenders of the crusty old monoculture accuse universities of becoming a new kind of liberal, right-on monoculture. Those referred to as culture warriors are defenders of their own monocultural models, who insist that any challenge to their cultural code is an affront. So universities have become battlegrounds of an aggressive conflict over what constitutes free speech. Although, as I shall suggest in a later episode, one should not exaggerate the extent to which most people working in universities are involved in or care about these battles. Faced with the challenge of how to balance the right to think and speak freely and transgressively with a demand not to be offended or hurt by the words and perspectives of others, the great danger is of a chilling effect in universities, whereby certain issues are avoided, views self-censored, and words rendered too morally loaded to even explore. One person who thought a lot about all of this is a Cambridge philosophy professor and director for freedom of speech and academic freedom at the university regulator, the Office for Students, Arif, Ahmed. Arif, what do you think it is that makes some people believe that it would be better for the world that certain views were never aired and never heard?
It's a good question. And I think there's been a variety of reasons if we go back in history back for thousands of years even. So in the past, for instance, there's a sort of religious motive, for instance. So in the case of religious views, it was something to do perhaps with the salvation of individual souls, or it was to do with the power of the church, or it was to do with perhaps the view that some religious doctrines, for instance, and this may apply to other views as well, simply couldn't withstand robust questioning and robust scrutiny, and therefore allowing contrary views, or as would have been regarded then heretical views, would be something that would destabilize them. So that was something in the past. And then moving on, you can have sort of political views where you have certain kinds of political arrangement, whether they're actually totalitarian or quasi-totalitarian or fascist, where clearly they can't brook political dissent. And they think because they're totalitarian, because they want to control people's minds as well as their conduct, but also because they think that it might undermine the regime in various ways. And that's something obviously that we see in the present day as well. But then also finally, there are other motives which perhaps can seem more benign. So for instance, there may be people who have genuinely good intentions. They might be concerned about people's welfare. They might be concerned that, for instance, certain views are not merely upsetting, but actually destructive of people's identity, of their psychological welfare. And therefore, in certain contexts, perhaps those views had best not be expressed. So there's a range of sorts of reasons, and I think they varied across historical and political contexts.
Do you have any sense of the type of person who favours banning voices that are discomforting to them? I mean, I suppose I'm asking here, what is it about some people who may be either religious or may have particular characteristics that make them vulnerable or make them a minority? What is it about some people that makes them open to uncomfortable ideas? And what is it about others that makes them less tolerant in this sense? Is there any kind of psychological understanding that we could bring to this?
There is. And I think, again, it's interesting that actually people have said, so for instance, the drive for censorship is one of the strongest, if not the strongest drive in human nature. And I don't know actually whether the right thing to say is that there are some people who are in favor of censorship and some people who are not, rather that in many people there might be an urge, for instance, or there might be some sympathy for censoring certain kinds of speech, but it varies on the speech and it varies on the people. So you can have, as you said, a kind of authoritarian approach, an authoritarian personality. You can also have people who are very well-meaning. You can have people who feel upset and want to shelter themselves because they feel insecure either about their own beliefs or because they feel that their identity is under threat. So it can range again from motives to do with self-protection all the way to other ones. And when you look at some of the studies, so for instance, there's been interesting work that's been done, for instance, in the context of totalitarianism. I've read work by people who lived under the Soviet bloc, for instance, in the 20th century. There's been interesting work done on it in England in the 17th century and later, when you think about religion and religious controversies and religious suppression. And obviously much more recently, there's also been work that's been done in the scientific context and mechanisms of scientific censorship. That was actually one other thing I should mention, which is sometimes it can happen that people will censor speech just because it actually is wrong, or because it retards the scientific debate. So though whether that's right in the case of Galileo or Lysenko, I would hesitate to say, but there probably have been cases in the history of science where that's true. So again, it's a range of things. And I think, who was it, Solzhenitsyn, who said that the sort of divide between good and evil runs through each individual. And it probably is also true that within each individual, there might be different elements, some of them, as I say, ostensibly benign, that can exhibit sympathy towards censorship, but other ones in other individuals are perhaps more evidently autocratic.
Let's get to universities. Some politicians have said for quite a while now that university campuses are perhaps have become unsafe spaces for free speech. To what extent do you consider that to be true?
I do think there is concern, and I think there are reasons for being concerned. I'll just cite a couple of, you could always, you could cite individual examples, but I'll just mention some statistics. So one source of evidence is the Academic Freedom Index, which, as you probably know, is a very large study that's been running for many years. The UK has fallen to about, I think, between 60th and 70th place in the world in that index. They rank all the countries in the world, and the UK has fallen to about 60th and 70th. And it's fallen significantly in the last 10 years, well below most European countries now. So that's one indication of changes that we've seen even in the last decade. Another one I would say is our own research. So we commissioned polling of academics that we published in the summer, which indicates that about 20%, so 1 in 5 academics feel afraid to discuss controversial subjects in their teaching. It rises to a higher level to doing controversial research. And also we find it significant that it's significantly more women than men are afraid to discuss controversial subjects, and significantly more non-white academics than white ones. So there are significant variations within it, but also the level itself is concerningly high.
That's interesting. Let's suppose that university campuses had a widespread and conspicuous problem of students stealing things from each other. Mm-hmm. For some reason, they just didn't respect the idea of property rights. I assume that one of the things we would be doing is looking to schools where young children's minds are being moulded to teach them about why stealing is wrong, why it's antisocial. Now, if students are not respecting one another's speech rights, should we in some way be connecting this to schools and to the preparation of young people for entry into spaces where diverse ideas are necessarily in circulation? Is there something specific that could be done at the school level to change the consciousness that has led to this fall in freedom of speech?
Yes, that's very interesting. I mean, one thing I would say, just in terms of opinions, I mean, I guess there's a question about what people think, and then there's also a question about their conduct. So just in terms of what people think, there is data. So for instance, I would mention there was a study done by HEPI, not about the Higher Education Policy Institute, not that long ago, and there was work done by Professor Duffy at King's College London, where they actually surveyed students and asked about their views in relation to freedom of speech. And you found that the proportion of students who thought it would be acceptable to shut down speakers, or acceptable not to let speakers come, or not to let subjects be taught if they were offensive, or if they affected people's feelings. And there were some figures there, that showed that there was perhaps widespread sympathy for potentially quite censorious activity towards speakers and controversial and dangerous ideas. It is an interesting question to what extent that arises at the sort of level of school, or that is something that can be best addressed at the school level. I do think it's an important, simply because it's a fundamental British value, is individual liberty and the rule of law. And those are sort of, individual liberty and the rule of law obviously encompass in part freedom of speech. So there is certainly a space for students and perhaps even children to be taught the value and the importance of being able to discuss all kinds of ideas, including controversial and difficult ones. The one thing I would say, however, I guess there's a couple of things I would caveat that with, though. The first thing is obviously that between the time that you're at school and the time that you go to university, so past the age of 18, there are sort of legal and psychological changes. So legally speaking, clearly, safeguarding duties will change, and the sorts of things that you can be exposed to will change. And also similarly, there's a level of psychological maturation. So one of the things that happens at university, I think, is that they're not just for information, but they're also for formation of individuals. And you develop a political consciousness whilst you're at university. So one question that's interesting, I think, is the extent to which that labour should be divided between children before they go to university and people who are at university. And we think that part of the approach should be that when people come to university or colleges, so into higher education, it's made clear to them that now they are in a space where perhaps they can expect more challenge than they did, and they can expect more exposure to ideas that they might find really disturbing or offensive or shocking.
Could you elaborate on that point about when they arrive at university, it should be made clear to them? I mean, I've been to lots and lots of orientation meetings where the students are being given a range of messages, from very functional things to big philosophical ambitions. Probably that first day is not going to do what you have in mind. How should universities do this?
Yeah, no, you're quite right. So one thing is there is now a statutory duty on universities and colleges that they not only have to have a free speech code of practice, but they have to bring it to the attention of students often enough, so once a year. So there is that sort of formal element of it. But you're quite right that by itself, that's not necessarily going to be enough. And I was sort of thinking partly by precept and partly by example. So there will be occasions when you can say, and it is important to say, to express and to reinforce messages about the importance of freedom of speech. And many universities will have as their advertised values, and certainly it's the fundamental value of university is the advancement of knowledge and the importance of freedom of speech and academic freedom to that. But perhaps equally important, as you say, is I think you're suggesting, is to do it by example. So, for instance, we're aware of universities that have started to set up fora for controversial debates, for instance, where you have speakers who are going to be unpopular and who are going to talk about really controversial topics, engaging publicly, and students are invited to that early on and perhaps throughout the academic year. So there are various series that universities have started to put on, potentially in response partly to their duty to promote freedom of speech, which is a new duty that they have. So for instance, you might have two people who are totally opposed on the Israel-Palestine debate, for example. Right. And they might have views, at least one of the sides might have views that many students might find deeply offensive and shocking. But not only is the university modelling that it thinks this kind of debate is helpful, but also the speakers themselves, if well chosen, will be able to model how to have a tolerant and rational debate. And even if they don't agree at the end, each side will see the other as human beings, and they will be able to engage on the merits of the issue rather than attacking each other as individuals, for instance. And the students will come away having learned something. And I know from my own experience, I was a teacher of philosophy at university for many years, that one of the best things that could come out of sort of seminars and classes on controversial issues was not necessarily that all the students changed their minds, many of them wouldn't, but they would see the force of arguments on the other side, and they wouldn't go away thinking that anyone who took this view about abortion or immigration or Israel and Palestine was necessarily evil, but rather they were responding differently to admittedly quite strong arguments.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea, and I think it's very important, as I listen to you, that the principles you're espousing are connected to that kind of practical proposal so that people can, then not simply pay lip service to them, so to speak. Do you think that politicians in their parliamentary debates and televised appearances set a particularly good example of free speech in action?
Well, I think as with anything, it's going to vary. So there'll be some politicians where you find, I won't name anyone. I'm a position professor expressing any political views, but there will be some politicians, obviously, where you'll find that they speak in ways that are sort of highly rhetorically charged and that misrepresent the other side, that are directed at manipulating their audiences potentially, and other ones who speak in ways that might be initially perhaps less attention grabbing, but actually make a deeper and more powerful argument, and over time perhaps can have a deeper impact. So there's a range of things that you can see with some politicians more than in others. I suppose there's no harm in me talking about historical figures whose political sort of output I find admirable. So an obvious example would be someone like Abraham Lincoln, who was clearly able to combine, I think, a very great depth of understanding with a very powerful sort of rhetorical approach, though obviously the context has changed, and the kinds of speech that deliver authority now in a political context are very different from the kind of thing that did in the Civil War times.
It's often struck me that I hear students criticising one another as sounding like a politician. Very rarely is it used as a positive statement, and I often think that some of the politicians who are concerned about how students argue should maybe focus on that a bit. As a philosopher, you will have thought, I'm sure, about the distinction between a political opponent who one thinks has simply got it wrong and a political opponent who is not in the least committed to telling the truth, who is perhaps a liar. How should democratic societies deal with the latter?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question. If I may go back, actually, Stephen, just to your earlier point, because I think that's fascinating. I don't know. You will know better than me to what extent. It's a new phenomenon that people don't trust politicians or think that political speech is untrustworthy. I mean, I would imagine to some extent the incentives on politicians have always been different from the incentives on scholars, and to some extent, they've always had reasons to present things in a one-sided way. And I think to some extent, an element of if not necessarily distrust, but at least of sort of healthy skepticism is probably a very good thing towards politicians. Is a very good thing in any democracy. And I would very much rather live in a world where we did naturally tend to treat what politicians said with a healthy level of skepticism and care, rather than with credulity, perhaps more so than perhaps other professions, simply because of the incentives upon them. I mean, but just moving on to your point about the difference between, there is a difference, and it's marked in philosophy, for instance, between people who speak with an intention, with at least an intention of expressing the truth or getting at something which is sensible and backed up by evidence, versus people who sort of speak with absolutely no interest into whether what they say is true, but simply for having an effect. And clearly that's something, again, where you see a spectrum. And in a democracy, you can obviously see the dangers of that. I think a couple of things I would say about that is that this may be one of the areas where any sort of authoritarian type of cure is likely to be worse than the disease. So, for instance, just imagine a world, for instance, where we had the government could appoint a censor, like the Lord Chamberlain or something, who could decide that if a particular politician wasn't interested in expressing the truth, then their words would be either voiced by an actor, to take an example at random, or actually just blanked out altogether. You can see straight away the practically endless possibilities for abuse that could create. So just imagine, suppose, again, to take another example, we were about to go to war with another country, and it was a matter on which our national security was said to depend. And there were some politicians on the left, let's say, who are very skeptical of this and who are critical, and the government could say, well, actually, not only they're not telling the truth, but they're doing so on a matter of vital national importance, so we need to shut them up, put them in prison. So as with many things in the area of free speech, you might think, well, here's some speech that actually it would be good to censor, or you can see the sort of short-term benefit in suppressing it. But the real question is, who gets to decide? And then what's the potential for that to be abused? So in a democracy, I think that's one. There are those dangers.
But are there ever moments where one should decide? I mean, I agree with you about the extreme caution and the consequences of not being cautious. But even so, are there points of view either expressed in the knowledge that they're lies, or perhaps not expressed in the knowledge of their lies, but which are so damaging were they to circulate that one should just try to stop them?
Yeah, so I suppose one thing that I would say is that there are very strong protections for political speech, and in the area of political speech, I think it would be very dangerous to try and draw some sort of line where you say, actually, these things, it's just I mean, an example would be saying there are no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. There would have been a time where that would have been perhaps the most people would have thought that's the most dangerous thing you can say, because it could lead to the destruction of London. So again, who gets to decide? However, I will say that the legal framework that we operate in, for instance, does include protections for speech under the European Convention of Human Rights. But those protections and our protections in the legislation for universities do not apply to speech that meets the very high standard imposed by Article 17 of that convention. So that's essentially described as speech that seeks to destroy other people's rights. And that will include, for instance, Nazism, very extreme forms of totalitarianism, very extreme, genuinely fascist speech. So that really genuinely destructive of rights speech does cross that line, but it's really important to keep in mind that that's an extremely high bar. And it is applied sometimes, and the court has applied it on occasion, but it is applied really to the most appalling kinds of speech. And the court has also recognised that political speech, by its nature, attracts very high levels of protection.
Let me ask you a final question, but let me put two statements to you. First, Britain is a thriving, tolerant society. The second, British democracy is in the midst of a fundamental crisis of intolerance. Which do you think is more true?
I think I'd say that I'm proud to live in a tolerant country, and in a country that is thriving. And one of the ways it thrives is through all the kinds of diversity that we have in this country. And this, of course, includes diversity of opinion. And I think that's something that's brilliant and long may it last. And I'm also very proud to work for the regulator for a sector, which is the university sector, that really is seeking, to encourage all kinds of tolerant debate and the thriving debates on a very wide range of subjects and all kinds of different opinions. And where it does that, I think that's brilliant, and I think it's the best place sector to do that. I do think, however, and I have said, that if we do move towards a more intolerant, whether from wherever it comes, intolerance of speech and intolerance of ideas that are controversial is likely to be one of the gravest threats to our democracy. Not only when you think about things like political violence, which we've suffered in this country as well. So we had, for instance, if you think about what happened, with Joe Cox just before the referendum, and other sorts of political intolerance, some of the things that Sarah Carr mentioned in her report, and we've seen elsewhere as well. I think that's a grave threat to democracy. But I also think that an equal threat to democracy in the long run is going to be if we have a higher education sector where people are not, they can go into it, spend 3 or 4 years not being exposed to ideas that they find difficult or offensive or shocking or distressing, and then come out with exactly the same views or political opinions that they had when they came in. I worry that will make people intolerant, incapable of engaging in debate themselves, and unable to cope when, as inevitably will happen after you leave university, you are exposed to a wide range of views. You are exposed to people who have different kinds of life to you, different opinions, different approaches to things, and you need to have a period and a place where you can safely explore and develop the resilience that you need in order for a democracy to thrive. So I suppose that's the way in which I would synthesize those two things. The first thing I think is something that I'm proud of, but the second thing is obviously something that ultimately would be a great source of concern.
I mean, it is ironic, is it not, that higher education, the very space within society where you would expect the most vibrant and diverse thinking to happen, is in some respects insulating itself against the rest of society in which perhaps it is happening more successfully. And there must be a problem.
I think it's a great opportunity for universities, actually, and colleges to sort of seize this opportunity to be the places where this happens, and the central place in our society where you have the most freedom to speak and to express ideas. For many people, you may not have the same opportunity in your life again. When you go out and work, there will be all kinds of inevitable constraints on what you can say. Having a place in your life where you develop political consciousness, you learn all kinds of things, you learn new ideas, and you get to explore and discuss them is really precious. And universities are the best placed, and colleges are the best placed institutions to offer that opportunity. And I think they probably always will be. And they really need to seize the opportunity to be that and to give that, and for that to be part of their unique selling point.
Well, Arif, I think universities will benefit from having the kind of thoughtful and balanced advice that you're able to bring to this discussion. And I very much enjoyed speaking to you, and I know listeners to this podcast will learn a lot. Thank you very much for taking part.
Thanks so much, Stephen. It's really good to meet you, and I hope we can carry on this conversation.
I have only one thing to say. You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender.
We cannot afford 4 more years of this, Philadelphia. But the good news is, right now you can choose change.
And I want you all to know that we are fighting the fake news. It's fake, phony, fake.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.